We're a couple of minutes behind schedule, but I know Shane likes to talk fast, so we'll be fine. No, just kidding. No, but he likes to get to the point, so that's good. So Shane is joining us from Australia, so again, another early morning out there. Shane's an associate professor of physical education and sport at Flinders University in Adelaide, South Australia. He's an award-winning teacher, educator, and coach educator, and he began teaching in 1988. His Twitter handle is Pilly66, so now you know how old he is. And he's coached numerous sports, including Aussie rules football, which he'll talk about today, soccer, basketball, cricket, triathlon, touch, rugby, volleyball, swimming, and athletics, particularly sprinting. And coach participants from entry levels to adult semi-professional sport. He's got several number of books, but his recent ones were the Perspectives on Athlete-Centered Coaching in 2018 that he edited, and the recent one, Perspectives on Game-Based Coaching. And he also has just published the Spectrum of Coaching Styles book, I believe, with is that with Mitch and Brendan? So that's a good read too. All these things are different, but they're the same. So hopefully, we'll intertwine Shane's experience with his presentation here and his work in AFL. So Shane, you're going to take the reins here.
I think so. Can you see my slide?
Yep, and I'm going to get you on the screen as well, looking bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Hopefully you've had a better cup of coffee than you'll get in the States, right?
No coffee, couple of glasses of water.
There you go. So you're ready to roll, buddy? Off you go.
I'm ready to roll. I can only see my slide deck, so if there are problems, use your voice, don't use the chat box. So I'm looking at providing a positive experience of learning in Australian football state league team. I use the term Australian football with the capital F there because I'm talking about what people would would use AFL, Australian Football League. So people are probably more familiar with AFL as the term, but it's the rules of Australian football, and Australian football is the correct name for the type of football that we play. First of all, I wish to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Ghana land. I pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. This land always was and always will be Ghana land. So in this session, I'll cover three aspects. The game sense approach is play with purpose. The game sense approach is an athlete-centered perspective, and the game sense approach positioned with physical literacy strategy as the two elements making the playing for life philosophy of Australian sport. So that we are speaking the same language, it's important to understand definitionally what I'm talking about as I refer to game sense. So the slide you see at the moment sets an equation for what game sense as an athlete outcome would be. And it's composed of those two intertwined elements that are seen as not just compatible, but taught together, not always taught together, but the focus of a training session is to teach those aspects of what to do, which is an athlete decision making, how to do it, which is the movement toolkit of an athlete. And we don't see game sense unless we actually see the athlete able to do it in context being the game. So in a game sense approach, when we refer to skill is a capability that we can only see in the competitive, the match, the game, the performance context. Outside of that, what we're actually getting a look at is a player's technical toolkit. So the game sense can be thought of as both an approach and it can be thought of as a pedagogy, which I'll move to now. When the game sense approach was first introduced, however, it was mainly introduced as small-sided games for the development of fundamental sports skills, even though it was originally trialled for sports coaching across all age groups and all tiers of competition. That was because many of the games could be scaled up to be used with more experienced players or scaled down to be used with novices who are still developing their fundamental movement toolkit. We can therefore look at a game and customize it to the needs of the player's challenge point. The other aspect that we need to be aware of in talking from an Australian context is we use this term craft to distinguish from the match simulations that come from working in games and working on technical aspects of a player's movement ability. And these technical aspects are refined movement capabilities that often don't emerge simply from the process of playing games. So a few years ago, I started to use the term play with purpose to describe the game sense approach. And the reason being is as I travelled around Australia and ran game sense coaching sessions and game sense workshops to cover the inquiry aspect of physical education teaching, I saw people were very comfortable with the idea of small-sided games and using games as a teaching context. Sports coaches and PE teachers have used games forever. The game sense approach is not unique because it uses games as a teaching tool. But what I found was that how to place games as a teaching tool in a coaching session, how to use the games specifically as an educative purpose was often what was lacking. Coaches would look at a game, go, that looks really suitable, players will enjoy that, and they roll out the game. The other aspect that was often lost is the harder aspect of doing a game sense approach, which is knowing when to inquire with an athlete, how to inquire with an athlete, so that we can shape and focus their capabilities towards ever improving movement possibilities. The other aspect that I found was often difficult for coaches was to understand when to put in isolated, task-related practice for athletes who were not showing improvement simply by playing the game. So I came up with this model, which you can see in the center is a play, inquire, play, which looks very similar to the tactical games model in the United States, where you would see play, reflect, or practice, and then play in a linear pathway. But the game sense approach was never set out with a formula for coaches to follow, like TGFU has the 6 steps which you follow in order, and so therefore it is linear, and so therefore there is a model, a very clear schema to follow for coaches to do a TGFU approach. So in summary, I describe the game sense approach as a true non-linear pedagogy because there are multiple pathways that a coach can take from that first play period that they use with their coaching group. Now we can explain this by looking at the difference between what's called a traditional approach and a game sense approach. And a traditional approach, which I was taught to teach and I was taught to coach, is based on a behaviourist understanding of you are training someone. Therefore, the emphasis is on the players reproducing what you show them. We talk of learning as being complicated because knowledge is having something that you acquire from a more experienced other. And so therefore, what a typical training session would look like, a lot of direct instruction where the coach is demonstrating and explaining, lots of drills, and maybe performance at the end. Junior coaches might use that as a reward for practicing hard. Senior coaches might see that as a culmination of the practice session. So it goes through direct instruction of skills, broken down through their drills, and then finally we expect players to be able to perform what was in those drills in the game at the end of the practice session. Alternatively, however, the game sense approach has been described as constructivist, where understanding arises from engagement in an authentic context. And in our case, the authentic context is the game that we're wanting people to learn. So therefore, the idea is construction of players' capabilities. So therefore, we need to know our athletes in order to be able to build from their movement possibilities. We therefore describe learning as complex because learning is participation and knowledge is actually the capacity to do things, not just the capacity to know things. And that led me to describe the idea of play with purpose. So in this idea that games are complex systems which reproduce patterns, so even though a moment in the game is always unique, from a cognitive perspective, we can say that that pattern can become familiar to the players. So therefore, there's a relational analysis between the player as a thinking, moving athlete and the patterns that they are seeing in the game. That's why elite coaches will often talk about, in training, you need to represent all the possibilities, all the scenarios, all the match simulations that are possible for the group. So when the players get out onto the field, the court, there is nothing that they haven't experienced before. So therefore, there's a high level of familiarity with the patterns that are going to be occurring during the game. So therefore, in a game sense approach, we talk about these three pedagogies: representation, simplification, or what more recently might be called scaling, and modification of games by elimination of aspects of them, exaggeration of aspects of them, or reduction of aspects of them, which in the 1970s might have been called conditioning a game with purpose. So coming back to the idea of play with purpose, which is in the chapter, the idea of a game sense approach doesn't eliminate the need for a warm-up, particularly with older athletes, although we might question the need for a warm-up with junior players. But in that warm-up, we progress through the closed to open skills to prepare mind and body for the period of play. Darren Burgess, one of the elite strength and conditioning coaches in world sport, said at a presentation once that that's often taken by the strength and conditioning coaches because it's not actually seen as part of practice. It's what we do before we get to the game day coaches and they start to teach the game. At the end of the training session, this is where we often see players not do a couple of laps around the oval, a few runs in the gym, and then some static stretches. In this slow build down of intensity, we'll see them working on aspects of the game which we would call their craft, which are in their performance improvement targets. Often that is tailored to a group of athletes that have similar performance improvement targets, and they'll be grouped together on a task. That might be a drill, that might be a match simulation, but it's working on a particular aspect of their game in order to make them a better player for the team. Alternatively, in some situations, we'll see that craft work put in that practice period after we've inquired following that first period of play, and the warm down will become what we call line group work. So in Australian football, we put our players into three lines: forwards, midfielders and defenders. They'll have particular match simulations, matchups, strategies that they'll be using for a game that's coming up, and it's during that line group work that we'll work on those specific aspects of play. So in the coaching session that I talk about, we worked through a series of small-sided games after the open and closed drills. We use that as retrieval practice so that we can assess the players in their learning, where they're at in their learning, which players might need some particular attention. And typically that might be something like a 9-a-side game of football with a particular focus. That particular focus could be 1 week where we say that you have to play on from a mark. In Australian football, if you take a fair catch or a mark, you can push back and have a protected kick until the umpire calls play on. But if we're preparing to play fast football, we might use this 9-a-side game and say that you have to play on from a mark because we're wanting to instill in our players the idea of playing fast football. We do our craft work on forwards, midfielders and backs after a period of inquiry on that play. And then we finish off with match simulation, bringing the craft work together so we can get the coordination between our lines. And then we finish off with our line group work at the end. For example, a midfielder might not be able to, what we call wedge, get under the armpit of an opponent while the ball's in the air to subtly push them off balance so they can break away from a contest while their opponent is off-footed. That's not something generally that an athlete will pick up from watching the game because it's such a nuanced, fine-tuned perspective, and something that we need to break out and first of all teach through an isolated practice task before the player is able to put it into performance. I use this sliding scale of understanding of the motivation of players and the realness, as Worthington called it, of the practice task when I think about what to do in the first game and then what to do in the match simulations. Generally in a practice situation, we won't want a fully competitive match because we're not wanting the players to get injured before the weekend, but it's going to be a coached practice game where we have a high degree of competitive pressure, but there might be players, for example, in green vests who are not able to be tackled because they've got an injury that we're trying to protect, but we want them to be involved in the match simulation so that they're fully aware of what the game tactics are. They haven't been ruled out of the game yet because we might be training on a Thursday night and playing on the Saturday. They'll have their final medical Friday night, and it's at that final medical whether we find out whether they're in or out of the team. So at this stage, we don't want an aggravated injury, so they're in their green vest. Might have 3 or 4 players running around in that situation. That's one of the things that might make it a coached practice game rather than a fully competitive match, because we've got a number of players that are, no tackle or light tackle as they go through that practice session. I've called them isolated practices, but in this schema that you see, they might be called related practices when we look at those isolated aspects of performance. So reflecting on my journey to this point of understanding to bring the presentation to an end, understanding how to modify, condition, some people now call it constrain a game purposefully towards the development of a tactical concept is actually the easy part of a game sense coaching approach. It does require people to have really good understanding of both the tactical and technical complexity of the game. But it's the understanding of the nature of inquiry and what question to ask, whether it's convergent, divergent or guided, with guided discovery, which is often associated with a game sense approach, being the most difficult style of questionings because the ordering of the sequence to deliberately lead a player to the aha moment of understanding is actually something that requires a fair bit of planning and is actually something that I find quite difficult to do. And I've never found anyone that I work with or that I've seen in practice who's able to do that guided discovery series of questions without pre-planning it before the coaching session, which means that you look at a game and you understand the teachable moment that's going to occur in that game, and that's where the game stops and you come in with the inquiry point to do the guided discovery. Sometimes it might take 5 or 6 minutes, other times 10 minutes into the game before that moment actually occurs. But one of the skills of a coach is knowing what game moment they want to see, because that's where they focus their teaching through the game. I quite like Russell and Siedentop's shaping strategy as a way of thinking about how to focus players' thinking and shape players' attention during the game. So it comes down to the coach really knowing what the desired game behaviour, the endpoint is that they're trying to seek, being able to sequence the game and in particular the questions as a series of steps that will lead to players progressing in their game performance or understanding. Clearly identifying the use of primes or cues to prepare the brain for the type of thinking that is necessary for performance in the game, and being able to reinforce those primes, that shaping and that focusing with sufficient amounts of play that we actually get consolidation of the understanding. So in summary, the experience I recall in the book chapter demonstrates the distinct features of positive pedagogy for sports coaching. Firstly, I emphasised engagement with the physical learning environment using a phased practice, such as a 9-a-side football game. I and other coaches ask questions to generate dialogue to engage player thinking in preference to instructing them what to do. And the word preference is important there. In a game sense approach, it does not mean that we don't tell. It means that we ask questions in preference to telling. But as I'm a fan of Mostyn's spectrum of teaching styles, I don't see that any particular teaching style is wrong. It's the skill of the teacher or the skill of the coach to know when and for what purpose they're using a particular teaching style. An inquiry-orientated environment was fostered to test and evaluate the solutions collectively and individually using those tactical timeouts when the moment of the game occurred that we wanted to teach through, and using freeze moments so the game became a tactical board, a living tactical board, so we could talk about what was happening and the alternatives that were available to players in the particular moment that we had frozen. And mistakes in decision making and movement execution were seen as learning opportunities, and so they were actually encouraged during the training session. So in summary, one of the really interesting developments that's occurred in Australia in recent years is Australian sport jumping on the physical literacy bandwagon and using that as a description of the objective of sport. What's become fascinating is that, as you see at the bottom of the diagram there, the game sense approach sits alongside the physical literacy strategy for the development of the skills, knowledge and capabilities to continue playing sport throughout life. So therefore, one assumes that the game sense approach is now seen, at least in an Australian context, as the pedagogy for the delivery of physical literacy in sports contexts. So Stephen, thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit of the work that I do and unpack some of the thinking that's in the chapter in your and Richard's books. If people are interested in following up with me, my contact details are there through that URL, that HTTP, and I welcome people contacting me and following up with questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks Shane for the presentation, slick as usual. And good to sort of bring in some different terms and that, and kind of explain them and show how they can knit together nicely to, you know, within the positive pedagogy framework. We have had one question that I can see. It was actually Nick Hill, who, you know, Nick. He said it depends, but what proportion of a session do you typically spend in the whole process? So it might be like, how much do you go with the whole? How much do you do the different parts? You know, like retrieval practice and the craft work and things like that. Is there a sort of time you aim for, or is it just it depends?
It truly is. It depends, and that it depends on how long the training session is going to be. So it's based on the volume that we want players to experience that day. So a Tuesday night training session would typically be 2 hours, of which probably at least an hour is in that game-based section, the game form practice. By the time you add in the craft work, the line work, the warm-up, that's probably an hour's work in those sections there. The guiding principle in a game sense approach would be that the games form the majority of the training session, and they form the focus of the training session. So what's done in the warm-up is preparing people for what's being focused on in the games. The line work, the craft work need to align with the overarching theme of the session, but we can never talk about how much time as a specific set amount, because if it's a Thursday night training session, we might only be out there for an hour because we're now 48 hours out from a game, and so we're going to have less volume. That volume might be less because we've got less time on the training track. So it truly is, it depends. For Tasha, yes, I do encourage decision making in the warm-ups. Often the strength and conditioning coach will ask one of the players to take part of that open and closed drill session. Sometimes the players are charged with actually coming up with what the open or closed drill component would be. And it's important also to recognise that one activity progresses from being closed where there is no defensive pressure, and then through the progressive addition of various aspects of opposition, it becomes open. So some people might call that a game, but in the skill coaching context that certainly I was brought up with, that would be called an open drill. It might have a game-like perspective, but it's not a game. So for example, we have a drill which we would call a 5-star activity, because the running pattern creates the shape of a star through the 5 points that the players are starting on. We might start off with that fully closed and the players just running the lines marker to marker. Then we might put in a couple of players to provide some body pressure, but not tackling pressure on the run-throughs. And then we might move towards full tackling pressure on the run-throughs. So it has that game-like oppositional element, but it's clearly not a game. It becomes an open drill because we have oppositional pressure on all of the movement executions that are occurring.
Good. We have another one. What's the what's the importance of coach experience? This is from Aaron. Coach experience in the implementation of game sense.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because often people assume that you need higher levels of game understanding as a coach in order to be able to execute a game sense approach. My own experience, I went to a level 2 coaching course. I heard about the work of Rick Charlesworth. Rick Charlesworth advocated starting every training session with small-sided games. He has gone on to be the most successful Australian international coach. So I thought, if he's doing that, there must be something in it. He then talked about, having what he called designer games that package technical, tactical and fitness work rather than separating out those components. And I started to play around with it in my own under 18 and under 16 teams. So at that stage, I literally was just exploring how a game sense approach works. So it's like anything, volume of practice over time, continue to learn about what the game sense approach is by professionally developing yourself, watching other people who are more experienced than yourself do it, and you get better. But I encourage people just to jump in with the principles and start exploring them through your own practice, just as we encourage our players to do at training.
Thanks for that, Shane. My mic was muted there. Rookie mistake. Nearly got through the whole thing without making a mistake like that. Ashley's got a question. Ashley Allenson, who you know, who works with us. So I'm going to ask Ashley to pop his camera on because he's sort of facilitating a broader Q&A. So if he puts his mic and video on, and then he can ask his question to you, Shane, and then any other questions that we have, we've got a few of the presenters still here. So we're just going to take like an open forum Q&A for the next 10 or 15 minutes and kind of like all be able to jump in and answer as appropriate. So I'll send Ashley live to ask Shane, and then we'll go to the broader Q&A.
Brilliant, thanks for that. So my question, Shane, great to see you again, was I often had coaches that use these freeze frame moments you talked about that were kind of used as a negative. It was always a way to kind of correct, and it's something that I kind of took away from my own coaching, or when I went into coaching from my playing experience, that it could be a very kind of confidence demoralizer. And then it's kind of, how do you make this approach more positive with your players? You talked about inquiry-based approaches. So how do you use these freeze moments, a positive aspects of your coaching?
Yeah, I'm reminded of a video that I showed with one of my coaching groups the other day. Comes from a couple of NFL coaches. And they talk about there's not one word that you haven't heard before that still is important for you to hear again. And I think freeze frames are like that. If you don't stop it, then you allow the habit to occur. And if the habit leads to a performance deficit, you're not doing the players any favours by not stopping and focusing on it. I understand your perspective that generally coaches freeze frame because there is something they want the players to see the alternatives to, and therefore you can position that as a deficit. But I think it's important to continually to frame these as positive conversations, because we're encouraging our players to operate at the edge of their capability, because we're trying to think about training as being more difficult than the game. So from a brain perspective, developing thinking players, we want that brain to go into a game going, practice has been harder than play. So if practice has been harder than play, I can meet every challenge today. So because the players are operating at the edge of their challenge point ability, errors will naturally occur. And we're framing that as a positive thing, a thing that we are encouraging at training. So therefore, if we're stopping to talk about those errors at training, the players need to be in an environment where that is seen as a positive to do. But it's like anything. If behind the scenes you are not rewarding, encouraging, framing, recognising when things go well, and all they hear from the coach is negative, this needs to improve, we should have done this differently, what are we thinking about this? And often when a coach asks, what are we thinking about this? It's because they want something different to be done. Then that'll affect the players' psyches. We can never do anything right. So it is important that the coach is looking for the moments of success, recognising those, rewarding those, and not just focusing on the negative. But the freeze frame is a tool that is mostly used to frame alternatives, and so therefore I get what you're saying, that it can be seen as a negative with the players. I guess it comes down to the type of environment you are trying to frame that is developed over time, and you need to be acknowledging success. If you're not acknowledging success and you're only acknowledging the deficits, then I do think you risk the players thinking that you're a bit of you're not so nice as a coach.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Shane.
Do you want to jump into that other question in the chat on the Q&A, Dr. Allenson, from Stephen Levin?
Yes, I was just about to. Thanks for that.
Perfect, thank you.
This was directed at Shane, but obviously to get more individuals involved in this process, I guess it can be opened up and just jump in. So would you advise kind of learning outcomes or core messages to be communicated to players before the session? And I guess this can go to kind of everybody. Shane, you might want to kick us off, especially from a positive pedagogy perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. The players need to know why we're doing what we're doing, so that the how and the why are linked together. That's both from a motivational perspective, so understanding why we're doing what we're doing will lead to the motivation to actually invest in it, but also so that the learning is explicit and visible. The expectations of the coach are not a secret, they're explicit, they're visible. We can get everybody focused on what's important. If we don't share those things at the start, then the players are guessing as to what the coach is thinking is important, what the success criteria for the training session is, and therefore if there is some confusion during training, we've contributed to it because we've not been explicit at the start, not only about why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing it, but by actually walking the players through the practice session before we start, so that there is familiarity with it before we get onto the court, the field, whatever environment that we're using. From an educational perspective, that is one of the most powerful instructional strategies that we can use to power up learning. There will be a number of players who are independent and self-regulated, and they want to fly ahead, they want to be organised, they want to know what's happening. And if we hide that from them, we provide a level of frustration for them too. But from Hattie's work in education circles, we know that this has one of the most high impact effects on coaching and should happen in any educational situation. So if we see the sports coach as a pedagogue, then we should be doing all aspects of powerful pedagogy.
Anybody else from the panel want to now chip in to echo Shane or talk about that?